After the first salutation was over, Miss Bretherton, making a strong mental effort to subdue her agitation, of which she was infinitely more capable than her companion, begged her to sit down, and then, placing herself where she could have, as a commentary on what she might induce her to say, the advantage of watching her countenance, she pronounced in a voice that she in vain labored to render steady, "My dear Miss Martha, I've suffered a great deal uneasiness since I last saw you, respecting the little boy for whom, concerning whom, I mean Michael Armstrong, Martha, his mother is very wretched because she cannot discover to what place he has been sent, and I, nothing doubting that it would be perfectly easy to learn this from you, rashly promised that I would obtain this information. Can you, dear girl, tell me more upon this subject now than you could when we last met?" "I cannot, Miss Bretherton," replied Martha Dowling, in a voice so low and husky as hardly to be audible, but with a complexion and features that spoke so plainly what was passing in her heart, that Mary felt ashamed of having placed herself where she could so distinctly read all she suffered, and leaving her chair to share the sofa on which the poor girl was seated, she took her hand and said, "My poor dear Martha, it would be better for us both that I should speak sincerely. I have become acquainted with an individual, Martha, who knows more, much more, than either you or I can do, my dear girl, respecting the factories, those great magazines of human life and labor, by which your father and mine also have grown from poverty to wealth. This person, Martha, on my questioning him respecting the probable destination of a child so circumstanced, did not scruple to reply that if his master were displeased and wished to be rid of him, there were places, factories, mills, dear Martha, where the business was so managed as to render labor very heavy punishment, and where it was easy to keep children, aye, hundreds of them, unseen and unknown for years. Do not tremble thus, dear Martha. Do not draw your hand away from me. Most sure am I that your heart and my heart must beat in sympathy on such a subject as this. Let us be mutually sincere, and we may help each other to undo whatever wrong may have been done. We both well know, that your father was displeased with this poor widow's son. We know, too, that he is a person of great power and influence. The boy is gone. He will not tell us where. What is the interference? Turn not from it, Martha Dowling. Turn not from it, my poor friend, but boldly and honestly seek out the truth, and let me know enough of it to save this helpless child from further suffering." "I have no means, Miss Bretherton," faltered poor Martha. "If all your dreadful thoughts were true, which you have no right to think they are, and still less have I, but if they were true, all true, I have no means to know it." "If we have any reason to believe them to be true," Martha said solemnly, "means must be taken, Martha Dowling, to stop further wrong, and this can only be by learning where Michael Armstrong has been sent. I apply to you for this with great reluctance, because I know the subject cannot be brought before you without causing you pain. But I feel it my duty not to shrink from this, and it is yours, my dear girl, to obtain the information I require." "But if I agree with you in this, Miss Bretherton, what are my means of obtaining it beyond your own?" said Martha, rousing herself, and feeling renewed courage, for remembering that there was no proof whatever of the boy's being otherwise than well and happy. "Nay, Martha," returned the heiress gravely, "among those engaged in your father's service, you can hardly be at a loss to find someone who must have been employed in removing him." And would you have me," replied the poor girl indignantly, "would you have me tamper with my father's servants in order to obtain a knowledge of what may be his will to keep secret? Miss Bretherton, I would rather die than do so." "I honor your filial feelings, Martha, and I grieve to think that you are placed in circumstances which must compel you to make them secondary," said Mary gently. "Nothing can make them secondary," retorted Martha warmly. "I love my father, and I hold my duty to him the first and highest I have to perform on earth." "Save only what you owe to your own soul, Martha Dowling," replied Martha. "Had you been yourself for nothing in this matter, I might think as you do, that your duty as a child must prevent you from interfering in it, though even that, I suspect, would be but doubtful morality. But, Martha, the case is otherwise. It was by your influence that this helpless widow was induced to send her child away. She did not trust your father, but she trusted you. Do you not know, Martha, that I speak the truth? And if I do, can you for an instant doubt your first duty is to redeem the pledge you gave to this poor trusting creature, who hazarded all that was dearest to her in life upon your assurance? A passionate burst of tears, that seemed rather to convulse than relieve the bosom on which they fell, was the only answer Mary received to her cogent reasonings. And so evident was the suffering of the innocent culprit, who appeared writhing under the discipline she inflicted, that nothing less deeply impressed on her heart than was the remembrance of Edward and his mother, and the grief that threatened to destroy them both, could have given her courage to persevere. Martha, dear Martha, be reasonable, cried Mary, throwing her arms around her. If you knew what I suffered in making you suffer, you would pity me. But I have no choice left me. I'm not a free agent, Martha, any more than you are. We are both bound in honor, honesty, Christian faith, and Christian mercy, not to let any feeling stop us till we have restored Mchl Armstrong to his mother. Restore him, sobbed Martha. Alas, Miss Brotherton, the poor woman herself has prevented the possibility of that. Do you not know that he is apprenticed? Let us but know where he is, Martha, and if the situation be one that his mother can reasonably disprove, there can be little doubt but means may be taken to release him. Teach us but where to find him, dearest Martha, cried Mary fervently, and we will all pray for blessings on your head. I cannot do it, replied Martha, with a sigh that very nearly approached a groan. How know you that you cannot, Martha? Will you not try to learn this nefarious secret? No, I will not, Miss Brotherton, replied the unhappy girl with sudden firmness. If any wrong be done to this boy, I know that it must rest upon my head. So let it. The remembrance of it may bring me to the grave, and there I shall find mercy and forgiveness. But it shall not place me in rebellion to my father, nor force me to reveal any secrets which it may be his pleasure to keep. Now let me go, Miss Brotherton. I doubt not you have acted according to your sense of duty, and so have I. In this at least we are equal. Pray let me go. I am not well, and greatly wish to be at home. Mary looked at her with surprise, and almost with terror. She was as pale as death, and shook as she stood up before her, as if she had been seized with an ague fit. Alas, Martha, she exclaimed, I have made you very miserable and very ill, yet have gained nothing by it. You shall go, my poor girl, you shall go instantly, but ere we part, let me implore you to examine in silence and alone the question of right and wrong in this case. Paint to yourself the misery of the wretched mother, and remember that yourself. I must say it, though I wring both our hearts as I do it. Yourself, Martha Dowling, are the cause of it. You have said enough, Miss Brotherton. Destroy my peace forever, replied the miserable girl, but not enough to make me act as a spy upon my father. Farewell. Do not let us meet again. It is too painful. Without waiting for an answer, Martha Dowling wrapped her shawl about her and hurried to the door. The carriage is not waiting, Miss Dowling, said the vexed and disappointed Mary, who had gained nothing from this painful interview but the conviction that the well-intentioned but erring Martha was as much persuaded of the boy's having been unfairly dealt with as herself. Let me order the carriage for you. No, I cannot wait. I can walk. I know the way. Indeed, I can stay no longer, replied Martha, hurrying on and closing the door of the room after her, and before Miss Brotherton could reopen it, she had already passed through the hall and was almost running from the house. Mary lost not a moment in summoning a servant and ordering the carriage to follow her with all speed, an order which was so well obeyed that the unhappy Martha was overtaken ere she had walked a mile, and gladly did she then avail herself of it, for by that time every other painful feeling was merged in the terror of having to explain to her father the cause of her having so parted with Miss Brotherton as to return unattended and on foot. Perfect love casteth out fear, and perfect fear may perhaps petrify the heart into a sort of unstruggling desperation. But a union of the two reduces the mind to a state of slavery the most abject, leaving no strength whereby any healthful moral feeling can be sustained. Martha's whole care on returning home was to satisfy her father that nothing particular had passed in her interview with the heiress, and, unfortunately for all parties, she succeeded. Miss Brotherton, meanwhile, mounted a little pony phaeton with Miss Tremlett, and with a heavy heart proceeded to Huxley Lane. But painful as was her errand, her condition was a far happier one than that of Martha Dowling, for in her there was no mixture of motives to paralyze every word and act. Her kind heart sought and found counsel in her sound and upright judgment, and, sustained by it, she executed her task without shrinking. A little reflection on the subject convinced her that it was now become her duty to confess to her poor client, not only that her exertions to discover the abode of Mchl had been unsuccessful, but that she began to fear that there must be some unpleasant reason for the difficulties thrown in the way of obtaining the information she had sought. It required some courage to utter this, but when it was done, Mary was surprised to perceive that its effect, both upon the mother and the son, was very trifling. Having candidly stated her fears, she remained silent, the eyes of both being fixed upon her with a sort of quiet hopelessness that was perhaps more painful to contemplate than more vehement demonstrations of grief. "Our thanks are not less due to you, ma'am," said the widow gently, "and don't vex your kind heart by thinking that we are disappointed. Edward and I guessed true from almost the first, that is, from when he was taken off without bidding us good-bye. Sir Matthew is known better by his mill people, ma'am, than by the great gentry that turn their eyes away from labour and sorrow to revel and grow fat upon our graves. You would never be like to hear the truth from them, and I am told that even now the country round rings with praises of Sir Matthew's goodness to Mchl. 'Tis bitter to hear, but it is God's will our portion should be bitter here. He has power to make it up to us hereafter, and it is there we must fix our hope." "Most sure and most blessed is that hope," replied Mary fervently. "Yet it should never check our efforts to put to profit the means of happiness he has granted us here. I have now told you the very worst, Miss Armstrong, for I have told you not only all I know, but all I fear, nor will I again pledge myself to do more than I am quite sure it is my power to perform. I think you will believe, without my talking about it, that I shall not give up the search I have undertaken. But till some new light reaches us, we should but waste our time and wear our spirits by speaking on the subject. Let us rather think and speak of the welfare of the dear boy that is left you. This will be no hindrance to our restoring his brother, if it be God's will that we should have the power. Tell me, Edward, how did you get on at school today?" "Everybody was kind to me," answered the boy. "That's well, dear boy, and everybody will be kind to you. He looks nicely in his new clothes, does he not, Miss Armstrong?" "He does indeed, ma'am, and I could almost fancy he'd look better in health already for having left the mill," replied the widow. I feel better," said Edward, looking at his mother with his soft, thoughtful eyes, "and I don't think that it would be impossible for me to grow well again." My boy, cried the cripple, raising herself in her bed and throwing her arms around him. "Should I dare to complain of anything, that is, if it were possible, but oh, Teddy, wouldn't he have given one of his little hands to see it?" This appeal, which in truth only echoed the thoughts of his own heart, overthrew all the courage of Edward, and his tears again flowed as fast as those of his poor mother, a renewal of weakness of which they might both have been still more ashamed than they were, had they not perceived that neither Miss Brotherton nor her old friend had dry eyes. Mary, however, was too wise to let this last. "This, dear boy," she said, "has said which ought to give us all courage. I can hardly tell you the delightful feelings which the hope of his restoration to health would give me. It would repay me 1,000-fold for all the pain I have suffered. Let us fix our thoughts on this hope. Trust me, it shall be realized, if medical skill and kind treatment can do it." It was with this assurance she left them, and if any earthly promise could have healed the anguish of the mother's heart, it would have been this. But her two children were so twinned and twisted together in her thoughts that meditating upon her hopes for Edward inevitably brought her terrors for Mchl before her, and it was but with a fitful sort of satisfaction that the boy dwelt upon his anticipations of being useful to her, or that she listened to him. 2 days after this, while Miss Brotherton and Miss Tremlett were pursuing their usual morning occupations in the boudoir, a servant announced that a lady and gentleman were in the drawing-room. Had the announcement been of a gentleman alone, Mary's thoughts would have instantly suggested Mr. Bell, for they had been fixed upon him and the hope of his coming through both the preceding days. But the mention of the lady puzzled her. Nevertheless, the gentleman was Mr. Bell, and no other, and the frank and simple kindness with which he said, as he led the lady forward to meet her, "Miss Brotherton, I want my wife to know you too," rendered the introduction as agreeable as it was unexpected. "If you and I, my dear young lady," said he, "take to consulting together concerning what we may hope and what we may do in aid of the suffering people of whom we are surrounded, we shall do well to take this good little woman into the committee, for she has probably more practical knowledge of the subject we are discussing when last we met than any other lady you should meet with." Equally cordial and sincere was the welcome Mary gave to her new friends, and if sympathy of feeling and of a community of interest on a subject of deep importance to them all could have sufficed to make them happy, the long morning they passed together would have been one of great enjoyment, but they were all too much in earnest to be called happy while dwelling upon the frightful subject to which their thoughts were turned. The longer Mary listened to those whose lives were passed in struggle to assuage the misery around them, and in battling with the horrid principles which produced it, the more deeply did she feel that she, too, was called upon to labor in the same thorny vineyard. Yet terrible as were the subjects they discussed, and sad as was the conviction that no power less mighty than that of the law could redress the evils they deplored, there was still something inexpressibly soothing to her feelings in finding herself thus in intimate relations with persons who comprehended and shared in the sentiments which had become so essentially a part of herself. Though her conscience had told her, from the first moment her attention had been called to the subject, that it was her duty not to turn away from it, she had hitherto met little but opposition from those around her, and though steadfast and firm in purpose, she had often felt heavy in spirit from knowing herself to be alone, when she so much wanted assistance and support. This oppressive loneliness she could never suffer from again, as long as Mr. Bell and his excellent wife were within her reach, and fervently did she bless the courage which had led her to their dwelling. Tidings of poor Mchl, however, there were none. Mr. Bell had sought information concerning him wherever he thought it possible to obtain them, but he had learnt nothing. Nevertheless, he declared himself by no means satisfied that the boy might not be at some one of the Bastille-like establishments to which he had applied. "I know them, and they know me too well," he said, "for me to place implicit confidence in any answer they may be pleased to make, to any question I may venture to ask. If I knew where to find a trustworthy stranger, who could not by possibility be recognized as any one as a friend of mine, I think the chances would be greatly in favor of our finding the boy at some of the noted apprenticing establishments which I have named, but in truth I do not know where to look for such a person." "Am I not such a one?" cried Mary, eagerly. "Hardly a creature in the world beyond the town of Ashley, its neighborhood, knows me personally, and in all such places as those you have named, the Emperor of all Russias would not be less likely to be recognized." "But how, my dear young lady, could you represent yourself with any face of probability as interested in the inquiries you would have to make?" demanded Mr. Bell. "Methinks, Mr. Bell," replied Mary, coloring with her own enthusiasm, "methinks I could carry through an enterprise which had the recovery of little Mchl for its object with a degree of diplomatic skill that would surprise you. I should not be by downright and direct inquiry that I should proceed. Where such inquiry would be likely to excite suspicion, I would only contrive to insinuate myself and my eyes, and would ask no questions, save what they should answer." "Many strangers traveling desire to see the factory, certainly," replied Mr. Bell musingly, "but you are so young to undertake a wandering expedition. And then, how could you be accompanied? Your servants would unquestionably announce you everywhere." "I am older, I think, than you suppose," replied Mary, "and if I undertake this, I would be accompanied by Miss Tremlett, with whom I have no reserves, and by no one else." "You cannot travel without attendants, Miss Brotherton," said the clergyman, looking at her kindly, but as if doubting whether she was quite in earnest. "Do not either of you judge me harshly," replied the heiress, with great earnestness. "Do not set me down in your judgments as a hot-headed girl, indifferent to the opinions of society, and anxious only to follow the whim of the moment. Did I belong to anyone, I think I should willingly yield to their guidance, but I am alone in the world. I have no responsibilities but to God and my own conscience, and the only way I know of by which I can make this desolate sort of freedom endurable is by fearlessly and without respect to any prejudice or opinion whatever, employ my preposterous wealth in assisting the miserable race from whose labors it had been extracted. If you can aid me in doing this, you will do me good, but you will do me none, Mr. Bell, by pointing out to me the etiquettes by which the movements of other young ladies are regulated. I cannot think that I have any right to a place among them, and I therefore feel that to check any possible usefulness by a constant reference to the usages of persons with whom I have little or nothing in common would be putting on a very heavy harness, neither effective for use nor for ornament. But something too much of this. I must not talk of myself, she added cheerfully. Let us examine the possibility of my setting off with Miss Tremlett on a little home tour, without announcing the important events to the neighborhood, or taking any servants with me to enact the part of fame behind my chariot. By what conveyance would you propose to travel, Miss Brotherton? Inquired Mr. Bell, still looking, as an American would say, as if he could not quite realize the scheme. Mary meditated for a moment, and then replied, In the first instance, if you and Mrs. Bell would permit it, we shall go to your house in the same manner as before, only carrying with us a small travelling trunk or so, such as would be necessary as if we were going to pass a week with you. On the following morning we would set off by the coach, in which you would secure places for us, at which we will order dinner and beds, like any other travelers, inquire of the waiter what would be the best way of getting sight of the factories. And he will tell you that such and such factories, naming precisely those in which there would not be the slightest chance of finding the boy, may be seen by application made to Mr. So-and-so, said Mr. Bell. Mary colored and seemed to be about to answer him, but either from consciousness that she had nothing very satisfactory to reply, or because she had some notion in her head not sufficiently digested to communicate, she changed her purpose, and instead of combating an objection which seemed almost fatal, drew from her pocket a set of little ivory tablets, on which she had written the names of all the establishments within a distance of 20 miles, notorious for taking apprentices, and of retaining them by means that covered the scenes of their labor into most strict and wretched prison house. She read their names aloud. These, I think, were all you mentioned to me, she said. I think they were, replied Mr. Bell, but to these, believe me, you will get no admission as visitor. Will you admit me as a visitor if I come to you the day after tomorrow, Mrs. Bell? Said the heiress, playfully and apparently wishing to waive any further discussion of her project. Most joyfully, was the kind and hospitable reply. Then, for the rest, we must trust to chance. And now, if you will let me, I will show you my pretty garden, said Miss Brotherton, rising, and taking from a chair by the open window the ever-ready shawl and parasol, which made her lawns and shrubberies essentially a part of her dwelling-place. Of all the fine things I possess, I believe I am only truly thankful for this, she continued. I hardly know how I should pass my life if I had not a garden. The garden was indeed one that spoke of its owner's love by a multitude of enjoyable nooks that seemed all courting her approach, and by that perfection of elegant neatness which is never found in equal degrees where the mistress is indifferent respecting it. To her new friend's praises, all this she listened with pleasure, and sketched many pleasant plans for future meetings, when they should not, as they declared unavoidable now, remain only while their house was resting. But Mary said not a word more on the subject of her proposed expedition till the very moment of their departure, and then it was only to remind them that they would see her come with her friend to claim their promised hospitality on the next day but one. This was received with renewed promises of a joyful welcome, and so they parted.